Greetings, this is Angelus de Mortia with another multiplayer build guide for Dragon Age Inquisition. So back we are with the Legionnaire. In the months since my last Legionnaire video, there have been several balance changes in Inquisition that have made certain builds more interesting that previously weren't as fun. One balance change in particular is the recent buffs to armor. Specifically, in accounting for the base armor was almost doubled for the highest tier armor for the warriors. While this makes my previous defender build now even more nigh indestructible, what is more fun is what else he can do. This brings us to the new build for the Legionnaire as a striker that I have come to call the Painbringer. He takes the hits, laughs in the enemy's face, then bludgeons the enemy to death. As a disclaimer, with moderately good equipment, this build is extremely durable even on perilous, and will allow pretty reckless play. But it does require some major help on Nightmare and above, as the overall damage output is much lower than other characters. Let's get started. Unbowed, on the surface, appears to be a personal defense skill that generates 10% guard per enemy within a small area around you. Sounds pretty basic, huh? Well, it goes a bit further than that. Unbowed has a small animation identical to Warcry, but instead of taunting enemies, it has a small area of effect stagger to those nearby enemies. The upgrade, Still Standing, doubles the guard generated by Unbowed. However, the best part is that it also instantly recovers you from enemy crowd control such as stuns, panic, and knockdown. While I'm not 100% certain of this, I believe this recovery factor actually is incorrectly given to you on the base skill, so you don't necessarily need to take the upgrade to have this perk. Next is Walking Fortress. Since my first Legionnaire guide, Walking Fortress was nerfed from an 8-second duration to a 6-second duration, but it does not seem to be the worst for wear. More importantly, Walking Fortress is a temporary invulnerability skill, seemingly ideal for a defender. So why is it so important to a striker? Simply put, Siege Breaker. This not only builds 10% guard, but it also reduces the cooldowns of all your other skills by 1 second each time the Legionnaire is hit while it's active. This is ideal for laying down some pain in the middle of a horde. Payback Strike, as with my first video, is 1 part crowd controlling melee attack, 1 part defensive utility. It's also poorly worded. Payback Strike does 200% weapon damage. But if you have been hit within the last 5 seconds, it does bonus damage. This is not actually applied as bonus damage, which is actually a specific multiplier in the damage formula, but rather it's simply a flat additive bonus to the base damage. It also knocks down any enemies in melee range in about a 200-degree arc around you under the same pretense, recent damage. Most importantly, however, is that Payback Strike, like Unbowed, counteracts enemy crowd control. The upgrade, Sweet Revenge, has been found to really only do half of what it claims. Payback Strike's damage bonus, as I said, is not really bonus damage, but Sweet Revenge is, effectively doubling the damage output if you've been hit recently. Despite both having the same damage bonus descriptor, they are not actually additive. Sweet Revenge does stun taunted enemies, but that is really not useful in this build. In case you haven't heard, Shield Bash got buffed. Now it's everyone's cup of tea. Simply put, it does 400% weapon damage and staggers any enemies it hits. If an enemy is daft enough to have guard around the Legionnaire, Shield Bash does a whopping 12 times damage to guard. The upgrade, Ring the Bell, increases the guard damage bonus by an additional 400%, bringing the total to an insane 16 times multiplier. The less obvious perk is that Shield Bash seems to also have a bit of range to it with this upgrade, seeing the Legionnaire lunge a small distance forward to hit enemies that are not within melee range. Now, before we get into the real effects of the warrior buffs and how they affect the Legionnaire, let's cover passives quickly here. Adamant and Trust the Steel increase your armor by 20% each. The latter of the two only if you have guard active. Bulwark and Untouchable Defense increase your guard by 50% each. Turn the Bolt increases your range defense by 50% for non-flanking attacks. Turn the Blade increases your front defense by 20%, which is applied to non-flanking melee, ranged, or magic attacks, and stacks with the Legionnaire's innate 30% front defense from his shield. Deep Reserves increases your stamina generation by 50% when the Legionnaire has below 50% stamina. Bear Mauls the Wolves makes the Legionnaire more difficult to stagger when hit with non-flanking attacks, and also no longer suffers from a damage bonus to flanking attacks. Flow of Battle reduces the cooldowns of all of the Legionnaire's abilities when he lands a critical hit. Now, before we get into the strategy, let's cover the buffs first and understand what changed to allow this build. Firstly, with the recent buffs to armor, both Adamant and Trust the Steel, with guard active, allow the Legionnaire to attain upwards of 300 armor. Front defense stacks additively with other defense types up to a cap of an 80% damage reduction, meaning that if you have Turn the Blade, you will max out a respective defense type, ranged, melee, or magic, of the damage reduction with 60 promotions in the corresponding attribute, Cunning, Constitution, or Willpower. If you do not have this many promotions, it's not that much of a worry, however. Walk down the math road with me for a moment. If the Legionnaire took a frontal hit that did 1000 damage, this is how it would break down with absolutely 0 promotions. 1000 base damage, minus 300 armor, and then if it was ranged damage, it would be a 80% damage reduction, resulting in 140 damage. If it was a melee attack, it would be a 50% damage reduction after that, which would be 350 melee damage. Magic damage, however, would still just be 500 damage because it ignores armor. So you can see that the 1000 base damage can get reduced up to almost 86%, which means it does very little damage in the end of it all. Secondly, to better understand the buffs to guard with Bulwark and Untouchable Defense, let's take a look back on how things used to be. Base guard is and was 25% of the warrior's maximum health. If the warrior had 1000 health, the maximum guard he'd have without any passives is 250. Untouchable Defense increased the Legionnaire's maximum guard by a flat value of 0.0625, 6.25% added to the base 25%. Yes, it was that worthless. It was one of the most untouchable passives on any warrior you could find. See what I did there? Bulwark did actually seem to work as intended, granting an additive 25% bonus to your base guard. Between these two, you could have an absolute maximum guard that was 56.25% of your health. Now, Bulwark and Untouchable Defense each grant an additive 50% bonus to guard. So now you can have a maximum guard value that is 125% of your health. And unlike Barrier, guard is affected by your character's armor, meaning it is literally like an extra 125% health that you can quickly regenerate. Now, with all of the technical stuff out of the way, let's put it all together. Thanks to the buffs to armor and guard, The Legionnaire can focus more on dishing out offensive strikes rather than constantly being on the defensive. Unbowed and Shield Bash have additional utility of staggering enemies, whereas Payback Strike will knock them down, granted that you were hit first. Walking Fortress adds some durability and generates guard, but most importantly it reduces your cooldowns. The strategy for any difficulty up to and potentially including Perilous, depending on your gear, is like this. Spam Shield Bash, spam Payback Strike, spam Unbowed, spam Walking Fortress, spam Basic Attack if none of those are currently available, and then laugh at all the enemies that attack you for 1 damage. Yep, that's it. Simple as that. Have a good night. We're done here. Oh yeah, Perilous isn't the end anymore, is it? See, with anyone that does not have the maximum promotions and the best gear, the Legionnaire is a meat grinder on Perilous, meaning that while he is nigh impossible to kill, his damage output is rather poor, so he takes all day to kill off waves of enemies. That's on Perilous. On Nightmare, unfortunately, sees the enemies with higher health and defense, meaning that he is even more of a meat grinder. Even worse, the enemies also do more damage on Nightmare as well, making the Legionnaire much less unkillable. While this build is still usable on Nightmare, you will want to play with extreme caution. On Heartbreaker, well, honestly, I would not recommend this build on Heartbreaker, Venatori. If and when other factions are made for Heartbreaker, then there may be more options for good old Corbin. But for now, Heartbreaker remains for me a place where only the Legionnaire Defender reigns. Your mileage may vary. As I always say, this is not the best build for the Legionnaire. There is no best build. Have another way to build the Legionnaire? Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you enjoyed the video or just have something to say, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Once again, this is Angelus de Mortiel, signing off.